So let's get started.
No problem.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jihan. First of all, a couple of housekeeping items. We will try and limit this presentation to a maximum of 45 minutes, door to door, including questions, so you don't lose focus. Number two, I wanted to say a little word about the real estate vertical within Life. Of course, Life started by being a gathering of financiers, investment bankers, etc., and it started opening up little by little recently to other businesses, including consultants, lawyers, etc. And I'm happy to say that real estate has made its way into that broader financier group. And we have now within Life a real estate vertical, which is sponsored by Jihan. And I have the pleasure and the honor of being one of the people who animate that vertical globally. And there's a number of the members in different parts of the world that are part of the steering group that are here to promote the real estate vertical within Life, and of course to promote networking in the real estate industry. So if you belong to that category, or if you know friends that belong to that real estate investment category, then would be very happy to look at each person and propose for that person to become a member, and if they want an active member. So that's it on the housekeeping. I'm gonna make, the purpose of this presentation is basically to talk to you about the COVID-19 impact on the real estate markets. So we have a very small part dedicated to global real estate and a bigger part dedicated to the UAE real estate. That part will be animated by Dana Salbak, who's here. You can see her. She sits in Dubai. Dana is our head of the MENA research, and she just came up with a research report and some very interesting findings on the UAE real estate, which we all knew was already in a downturn even before the COVID-19. So on my side, I'm going to give you literally 3 to 4 minutes overview on what's going on globally, and I definitely invite you to come back to me offline if there is a specific subject. But given we're talking about global real estate, we have no choice but to remain high level. But again, at JLL, we have the ability to really drill deep in any sector, in any geography around the world, and therefore do not hesitate to come back to me. So I'll start now. The corona crisis has had a sudden and significant impact on all aspects of people's life. Global economic growth, as we all know, came to an abrupt halt in Q1. And we are talking here about the first global quarterly contraction since the global financial crisis. Of course, different parts of the world are at different stages of dealing with the pandemic. In real estate, policies vary by country, but it includes as helps some kind of moratoriums on eviction, mortgage holidays, retailer tax relief, and rent renegotiations. JLL believes that businesses will not go back to the way we knew before the pandemic, but they will use this crisis to reinvent themselves, to be more resilient, adapting to their operational models and to the new normal. In the real estate capital markets, in the global real estate capital markets, we are seeing over the short term, investment activity is really contracting significantly. There are big challenges on the valuation of the real estate side. The uncertainty creates all sorts of barriers to investors' ability to appropriately price the risk. Of course, defensive sectors such as the healthcare and the logistics asset continue to garner interest, and active investors consider them as being extremely defensive and have a very strong interest, I would say, nowadays to gain exposure. It's always easier said than done. In the office sector, in the short term, we believe that the flexible working space is likely to undergo significant consolidation. When I say flexible working space, I mean the likes of WeWork, Although in the long term, this flexible working space theme will remain a key feature of global office markets. In the retail sector, I think the retailers' primary focus in the near term is to preserve their cash. So they are literally, in Arabic we say, bibuz al-madfa. They are the one who are in the front lines and supporting really the immediate impact of this crisis. And therefore, they are in a crisis mood and seeking all sorts of advice and help from their government in order to sustain this period. Logistics sector. This is a sector that people talk a lot about being resilient, and absolutely it is resilient. We are seeing a very strong interest from global investors in logistics. And I'd like to say here that you cannot paint everyone with the same brush. Yes, there are some winners and losers in the logistics sectors. And this logistic sector has also suffered from some massive disruption in global supply chains, as we all know. Hospitality sector. As we all know, international travel around the world has ground to a complete halt, directly impacting the hotel market. Once the industry starts to recover again, the destinations and types and preferred types of lodging will change. There is no doubt about that. Finally, the living sector. When I say living sector, I mean residential, but also it can be elderly nursing homes, it can be student accommodation, it can be healthcare. So this living sector, they are generally viewed to be more resilient in the face of a downturn. The multifamily sector is usually considered to be the most resilient sector. And this is, of course, being supported, at least in the short term, by various income protection schemes. So finally, and before leaving the ground to Dana, the way we live and work is changing, and some of the emerging trends will become part of the new normal. At the same time, many of the familiar pre-COVID-19 structural trends will be reinforced and will continue to shape the real estate sector. These include, of course, growth in corporate outsourcing, rising capital allocation to real estate, urbanization, technology, sustainability, and flexible working. So without dwelling too much, I would like Dana to give us an overview on the UAE sector, which, as I said, was already in a bad mood pre-COVID. And now Dana will give you the update. Dana, over to you.
Thank you, Fadi. Thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me quite clearly. Thank you all for joining us. Good morning if you're in London, Europe. Good afternoon. It's officially 12. So good afternoon for people in Dubai. So thank you for that intro, Fadi. This is on the back of a global report that we put out on the impact on real estate. It's a report that's being updated almost on a weekly basis, and we're more than happy to be sharing some of those updates with you. But as Fadi mentioned, I will focus mainly on the regional markets with an emphasis on Dubai. I'm trying to move my slides, just one second. And hopefully you can find some kind of insight into what is happening in the market across all the asset classes, again with a regional view, but more specifically focused on the UAE. So you could just bear with me 1 second because my slides are not moving for some reason.
Dana, just maybe unshare and then share again. It could be.
Yeah, I'm going to try and doing that.
Technology is playing tricks on us today, huh?
I know. Let's see.
There we go. That works, Dana.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, cool. That works. Again, sorry for that, guys. Maybe more so reason to prove that we actually need to be in the office and interact with each other as opposed to speaking on through virtually through a screen. So just quickly, kind of what we'll touch upon today. We look at some of the economic and business impact of COVID, just very generally, to give you a bit of a macro environment, looking at some of the social distancing measures, the impact that has had. There's charts that produced by Oxford, which I really like sharing, containment, stringency, which just basically show the region and how those strategies are compared to global markets, Asia and across Europe. And then we'll quickly dive into the real estate impact. I've got a couple of slides that will show the short-term, long-term, but I won't focus too much on those because Fadi touched upon them. Of course, this presentation will be available to all the members and all the participants with us today, so you can take your time and read those. But quickly, I'll tie in the impact on our markets under each of those sectors. And then we'll finish up with some final thoughts, and they're actually questions which I'll put out there to kind of instigate some conversation amongst each other. And then obviously we'll open it for some Q&A. So just to begin, to really assess the severity of the impact on the economy, we need to look at some of the measures put in place to restrict activity and contain the virus. And it comes as no surprise that these are measures basically that have been adopted across the globe. They've been adopted across our region, as in the Middle East and North Africa. And again, specifically, if you want to take it to the UAE or to Dubai, all of these measures, these numerous measures and these examples have been adopted by the governments. The impact of these has now been translated into an index developed by researchers at Oxford University. And this is what I was referring to. This index shows you, when these measures came into effect and how stringent they were. And again, I mean, this isn't, this is sporadically updated. There's always some revisions of stringency measures, but nonetheless, it's just basically a gauge to assess how strict our governments have been in responding compared to other countries. And you'll see here in places in Asia, over the chart on the left, in China especially, the measures have only been in place just a little longer, if not around the same time, than in the UAE and KSA, which is the chart in the middle, but obviously far more stringently. So you can see the index is all the way up to 78, whereas in the UAE, the chart in the middle, kind of gradually growing, and then towards mid-March, that's when things really started to ramp up. Of course, there are examples of countries that have taken a completely different approach. In Asia, Singapore, for example, took a tougher approach from day one, but really didn't impose such strict isolation measures. And the same is of Sweden. And there's a lot of research that's currently coming out, whether it's articles on the BBC or studies by universities that are looking at Sweden as a case study. It's interesting today, actually, in the news, there was a chart that looks at the number of deaths in Sweden versus other Nordic countries, and they do actually have a much higher number of deaths. They still kind of adopted this approach where they didn't impose such strict lockdown measures. It was pretty much life as normal. Moving to the chart on the far right, we can see how measures in the US and the UK only gradually came in place, and are still relatively below what other countries, whether in Asia or in MENA, have adopted. Obviously, where we are today in the Middle East, things are easing down, particularly in the UAE and Saudi Arabia. In the UAE, the lockdown is only imposed, the curfew is only imposed from 10 p.m. until 6 a.m. During the day, it's not life as normal, life as a new normal, so to speak, where retail centers, offices can all kind of go back to operation with a 30% capacity. Again, the impact of that, or why these measures were taken, is a big question. And I think Fadi and I were discussing this briefly when we were prepping last week ahead of this. I mean, I'm keen to hear your thoughts, whether you think this is a rational approach. Is it on the back of a need to kind of stimulate the economy again, move the economy back into action? Or is it more of a, we now know how to deal with it, let's just slowly open it up and see where it takes us? Or is it more of a, this is going to end soon, they're quite confident about it? So these are kind of questions that we can address later from your experiences, whether you're based in Dubai, UK, or Geneva. It'd be interesting to hear your thoughts. And again, the extent of the impact will determine the speed and shape of the recovery. If you want to look ahead in the short term, as Fadi mentioned, the impact has been undeniable. At the time of putting this together, the consensus forecast was for the sharp shock to the global economy in the first half of 2020, followed by a bounce back in the second half. Again, a lot of this is dependent on the ease of easing some of the lockdown measures and the social distancing measures. In the illustration on the left, this is pretty much the short-term or immediate impact, which will result in a temporary loss, but a more immediate bounce back, this V curve. In the second illustration on the right, this is a reflection of longer lasting effects, where we're looking at a flatter and more gradual recovery. And again, the determinants of which course we're going down is really the areas that are stipulated below: the financial markets, real economic indicators, and policy responses. I want to focus a bit on the real economic indicators here to bring it a bit regionally. These are some of the latest forecasts that were issued by IMF, the Q1 forecasts. They revise these every quarter. And you'll see here the revision for the whole global economy, for the global growth projections for the global economy, were downgraded to about 2.8%, a downturn of 2.8% for the global economy in 2020. Advanced economies taking a much bigger burden, whereas emerging markets and developing economies, where the Middle East is based, taking less of a hit. We move over to the chart on the right, we'll see these split by the main markets: Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Egypt. Saudi Arabia is expected to see a growth contraction of about 2.3%, whereas the UAE, Saudi Arabia is also coming from a low base given growth in 2019. Yes, there has been a lot of measures to stimulate the non-oil economic sector growth, but I think the oil GDP still makes up for a large portion of the economy, hence the conservative growth in 2019. If we look over in the UAE, a much greater decline expected in the growth in 2020. This is on the back of oil also, particularly in Abu Dhabi, but also for Dubai, really hit by hospitality and tourism. And you know, it's a big chunk of the economy in Dubai. Egypt, on the other hand, a star performer in 2019. Yes, we are expected to see growth contract in 2020, but still performing more positively than the other regional countries. One thing Egypt benefits from here versus the UAE is the strength of the domestic demand, basically. Whereas UAE relies a lot on whether it's investors or tourists or spending. A lot of it is driven by the global market. Egypt, on the other hand, benefits from that really strong domestic demand. Moving quickly on to the implications for the real estate markets, which is why we're here. This is kind of a summary of everything that Fadi really talked about what we think the short-term and long-term impacts are for each of our client base, which is the occupiers and the investor, but also for each asset class. Fadi talked briefly about investors. I'll just talk quickly about occupiers. Obviously, we saw the shift in priorities and focus to be on business operations, on business continuity. Preparedness here was critical. Workforce also, people's health and well-being. Obviously, the financial impact, which was really multifaceted, and communications. It's proved essential to provide transparency to staff and to the wider business. In terms of capital markets, and again, I'm just quickly going to go through this because Fadi talked about it. In terms of what we're seeing from our latest global markets perspective, that's actually going to get launched next week. We did see a slowdown in Q1 2020 investment activity. It's expected, and we expect that to continue into the second quarter as well. So a much slower activity in the first half of 2020. Again, as Fadi mentioned, investors applying more due diligence, but also a lower practical ability to execute transactions. Hospitality and retail being the two sectors that have seen the sharpest decline in sentiment. And I'll move over to talk about hotels and hospitality. We've sequenced these property sectors to really reflect the level of short-term risk, with hotels, as I mentioned, experiencing the most short-term volatility in performance on the back of travel restrictions. What that means or how that was translated in the region, I like to call this a tale of two halves, mainly because the beginning of Q1 started quite strongly. Hotel markets across the region were performing relatively higher on an annual basis, on a year-to-year basis. It was only up until about year to Feb. So these occupancy rates that you see on the far right, these are year to Feb occupancy rates. You see Dubai recorded an 81% increase. And that's actually an increase from year to Feb 2019, which recorded 78%. Cairo as well, you can see here the Cairo chart in the light, Cairo and Giza in the light gray. Obviously, tough period in 2011 and 2013, but then really picked up, and Cairo was headed towards re-establishing itself as a tourist destination. Abu Dhabi, interestingly, one that has really picked up in 2019. An interesting fact, Abu Dhabi was the only market in 2019 that saw an increase in performance levels. And that came on the back of a lot of the government incentives for the sector, and also initiatives. In 2019, early 2019, there was a Special Olympics, there was the papal visit, a lot of focus on culture. So that really promoted Abu Dhabi's tourism sector. Riyadh business travel has obviously come down a lot, but again, at 74% in the first 2 months, much healthier than where we were in the year to Feb 2019. Jeddah is an interesting one because it really fluctuates. It's very seasonal. Obviously, Jeddah was expected to pick up on the back of Hajj and Umrah. Those two are no longer going along, at least for now. So we expect further pressure on that market. Coming back to Dubai, just to keep this focused a bit on Dubai and our expectation where we think the hotel market is headed. From a performance level, so looking at occupancy rates, average daily room rates, and the revenues per available room, obviously expected to be under a lot of pressure over the next couple of months. We know Dubai is cyclical when it comes to tourism and hospitality. We are in the month of Ramadan as we speak, and then we're coming onto the summer. So the expectation is that they're not going to stay as low as they are now, which I think the latest estimate was about 23%. We might see a pickup, but I think we will stay within the 50 to 60% as opposed to these high numbers. The expectation is for the sector to recover over the last quarter of the year, which is usually a strong year. Having said that, the expectation has been revised downwards from what it would have been if Expo was still going to be hosted this year. So they were targeting 20 million passengers, 20 million tourist arrivals in Q4 for Expo. Obviously that is no longer the target, and we're more than likely not going to see those numbers this year. Moving on, if we look at retail, which is the second sector that has kind of seen the biggest impact, and as Fadi said, mainly from reduced domestic spending, but also again, in the case of Dubai, which is a huge retail destination, we're seeing the slowdown in tourist spending. Obviously, the non-existence of tourist spending is having a major impact. An interesting one in the retail sector, particularly in Dubai, and I'm quickly going to move into the slide. Dubai has seen, the retail sector globally had seen some challenges on the back of the growth in e-commerce. We talk about changing consumer preferences, which has resulted in a lot of department stores shutting down, a focus on more unique niche products, a huge focus on sustainability. And I was on an EMEA call yesterday where I presented on sustainability in fashion as well on the back of COVID. So a huge focus on that as well. But added to all of that, what really put the sector under pressure in Dubai, the performance of the retail sector under pressure, is retail supply. And I think it comes as no surprise whether you live in Dubai or not. We kind of understand these numbers a bit and see on the ground that the market is really oversupplied. There is currently 4 million square meters of GLA, and that's the gross leasable space in Dubai. That's across retail centers. In 2020 alone, an additional 1 million was going to be delivered. This 1 million is made up of 2 large malls, which are pretty much the size of Dubai Mall. Now, of course, while there has not been any official enforcement of a lockdown or a closing of construction sites, there will be delays to the handover of these projects on the back of reduced manpower, supply chain disruptions, which Fadi alluded to as well. So these projects are likely going to push into 2021 and 2022. And you can see again from the chart here, in 2021, the gray bar is what's currently under construction. There's really not that much. and there's not much in 2022 either. So the fact that these projects are going to get phased out or spread out over the next 2 years is actually a good sign and might result in some balancing of the market when it comes to the retail sector, particularly since it's going to be extremely difficult to stimulate demand in 2020 as we stand now. Moving over to the industry and logistics, which is a sector that we've recently become very active in. Good timing for us as JLL as well, given it's the sector that's really performing quite well. Yes, there is the immediate impact of supply chain disruptions. We saw obviously China's manufacturing sector had contracted. That resulted in a lot of shortages and temporary suspension of production, or you know, of kind of the transfer of products. Inventory levels may have declined. So kind of in the medium term, I think a lot of the businesses or retailers have two options. You either increase your you diversify in terms of sourcing, where you're getting your products from, or you increase your inventory in the longer term. Either way, our outlook for the sector is more positive than it is for the other sectors. Again, with the growth of e-commerce, particularly in this region, e-commerce is expected to grow at a rate of 13% over the next couple of years. And that's on the back of estimates for online retailing, basically. And so we think the sector could become a permanent part of the retail landscape, which would boost demand for logistics spaces even further. Moving over to the office sector, and again, I'm just skimming quickly through these, but the presentation will be made available, and I'm more than happy to take questions after this. Short-term disruptions has meant people work from home, and we are seeing that extend. Yes, in Dubai, the Department of Economic Development has mandated that 30% of the workforce can go back to the offices, but obviously there's a lot of logistics involved here. Around the cleanliness and the hygiene of the office, the redesigning the office, so to speak, as well, by having 2-meter distance between desks, 30% capacity we already discussed, but also how many people you can have in a meeting room. So we don't necessarily think that people are going to rush back to go into the offices. Having said that, from a landlord perspective, landlords with longer lease terms, so 3 to 5 years, as they typically are in the UAE, are relatively protected. The more vulnerable, as it says there on the slide, is landlords with short-term lease exposures. So in the short term, co-working spaces, the likes of WeWork, is likely to come under pressure. Again, having said that, there was an article today about how WeWork is redesigning their co-working spaces to take into account a lot of the measures that other offices are doing as well. So it might be a sector that will pick up. In the long term, we don't necessarily think this is going to be the death of the workspace, so to speak, or the office. We just think that this is really going to push developers and corporates as well, if they really want to attract and retain tenants, into focusing on health, well-being, collaboration, and productivity. Bringing the conversation back to the region, and the reason I have kind of the other cities in there as well is just for you to compare. I'm not going to really touch upon them, but if you want me to, or if you have any questions, more than happy to take those again. This is our property clock, property cycle. He's not a fan of this, but you can see here that pretty much all the cities, and Dubai as well, has been under pressure. The office rental growth has been under pressure, and this reflects the rental growth in the office sector. Dubai was close to bottoming out, and the reason mainly is because on the back of limited supply, particularly in grade A space. So grade A space, if you're familiar with Dubai, or if you're overseas and you've heard of it, is things like the DIFC, International Financial Center. It comes with international legislation, international mandates. Large corporates occupy that space. So there's really limited availability where demand stays strong. So that's really kind of helped the office sector stay somewhat stable in that position for some time. But also there's a huge supply of grade B space, which is putting rents under pressure. And that's normally not taken up easily. It's usually strata owned. It's in relatively non-favorable locations compared to grade A space. accessibility and amenities remain an issue there. Just quickly, you'll see that Cairo, again, was our stellar performer, not just in terms of an economy, but also from a real estate perspective. So Cairo did see a period of healthy rental growth acceleration and is currently, has been in that location for some time, has been on that spot for some time. The true impact of whether things are going to slow down, rents are going to slow down or not, we can only assess it once we're back in business. We know for now, some landlords have offered rent reliefs for either a period of time or from now till the end of the year. So it's really difficult to assess. But definitely think that all cities will be in the rents falling category towards the end of the year. Moving over to living, and this is a new sector that we've kind of looked at that really looks beyond residential into the more resilient asset classes, which are student accommodation, senior living or healthcare, and co-living, which is becoming quite popular again in the region, in the UAE. Emaar, the largest developers, have a co-living concept collective, which is out in Dubai Hills estate. So again, a lot of attention and traction. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because maybe it's not something that we're familiar with in the region, but going to the residential sector. And again, our property cycle here, looking at where we are. Dubai, again, at the bottom of the market. The expectation was that Dubai would bottom out this year, would see some level of stability from now until Expo. Our view was not that things were going to accelerate or things were going to pick up with Expo, because that has already been priced in when it was announced that Dubai would host Expo. But more or less, we expected the market to at least stabilize for some time on the back of positive sentiment. The market does remain under pressure there. There's a considerable amount of supply, but just like with the retail sector, that supply was due to come in 2020 because there was the pressure to deliver all of that ahead of Expo. Now that that pressure is no longer available, these projects are likely to be phased out over the next couple of years, which could balance the supply and demand, which Dubai was struggling with. Abu Dhabi, on the other hand, if Dubai has a problem of supply, Abu Dhabi has a problem of demand. The government and the largest developer there, which is Aldar, which is semi-government, has launched a lot of initiatives to promote demand. So Abu Dhabi has a healthier balance between supply and demand, and that's likely a sector that's going to perform better. It's likely a market that's going to perform better than Dubai in the residential sector because of the stimulus that have come in. In Dubai, we haven't really seen much stimulus to stimulate demand currently. Again, you'll notice Cairo is a market that had already seen rental growth accelerating and is now kind of completing its cycle. Again, we do expect a lot of these sectors to be in the rents falling quadrant by the end of the year. If you want to put a number on it, I know some people might want to put a number on it just to put things in perspective. Where we are in Dubai today, we're still at least 20% higher in terms of sale prices. We're at least 20% higher from where we were in 2009, which was the lowest point of the market on the back of the global financial crisis. So we're still trading at much higher levels. Are we going to go down to those levels? Again, a lot of it will depend on the stimulus or further stimulus that will come in to support the residential market and to support that sector. Some final thoughts. I'm conscious I've spoken a lot. Sorry about that. Some final thoughts, and again, these are questions that we're kind of addressing. Looking at technology and how technology is going to improve the experience across all asset classes going forward. Sustainability as well, carbon emission reduction, and Fadi has been a champion of sustainability for us, so he can talk a bit more about that. And again, logistics. What does the deglobalization of supply chains mean to businesses and to logistics? So I'll leave you with these as food for thought and take questions. I'm pretty sure some questions popped in here.
Yeah. So we're happy for you to either type your questions in the Q&A or raise your hand, and we'll unmute you if you have live questions.
So again, we'll make this presentation available for anyone who wants it. If you want to go through it at your own pace and then come back to questions, more than happy to address those. Jihad, is there some, that's the chat that's different in the Q&A.
Yeah, no, there's not a question yet that I can see. Anybody have any questions? Please do raise your hand or
Fadi, you did forget to mention in the beginning that this was Chatham House rules apply. You always like to start with that one. Maybe that will have people ask more controversial questions.
Yeah, I think we have a question. I'm just trying to find. There we go. Okay, Raji Khouri. I think can you?
Yeah. Hi. Hi, Fadi. Hi.
Hi, Raji.
Hi, Dana.
Hi.
Thank you for a great presentation. I do share your thoughts on the bit of optimism, but Dubai is basically dependent on aviation, which is Emirates, and hospitality, tourism, and all that. Even when things open up and everybody goes back to work, how will these things, especially the hotel sector, the commercial real estate sector, the retail sector, people moving now more to online stuff, getting things online, restaurants, deliveries. How confident are you for people to actually go back to their work, to restaurants and to hotels? And how is that priced into the value? You've mentioned, Dana, that we're back to 2009 levels. Shouldn't we even be lower than that? Aren't we still overpriced in terms of real estate? And also, you've mentioned that there are 2 malls that are supposed to come as big as Dubai Mall to the market in 2020. If even that is postponed to 2021, does the market really have that appetite to handle all that real estate coming to the market? I'm particularly concerned about that, especially when it comes to Dubai. I'm a big champion of Dubai, and I love the business model of Dubai. But with all this deglobalization coming, or these disrupted supply chains, Dubai is a champion of globalization. So I'll keep that with you. I'll no longer say, but what's the pessimistic scenario here? I find your assessment as a bit optimistic, in my opinion. What's the pessimistic scenario? What can we see in case things don't go the way we discount them to be?
No, look, I completely agree. I mean, I think, and again, doing a lot of readings on the back of everything that's happened, this whole concept of deglobalization, it's cities like Dubai that are more at risk from the impact of COVID than other cities that are self-satisfactory, so to speak, or to kind of have their own manufacturing, have their own industry, and have their own production to be able to sustain themselves in a similar situation. I do envisage that a lot more effort will be placed on that. A lot more investment will go into that. We'll go into developing cities as, how do we sustain ourselves, developing some level of local production. Of course, given Dubai's model, as you said, we're far away from that. So it's going to take some time to go to that. I'm not necessarily overly optimistic if I came across as that. But I think that with a place like Dubai, and given the government's commitment to achieving certain milestones, that there will be a lot injected into the economy to keep it going, at least at a rate that it is currently. Is that going to impact values? Of course it is. Is that going to move away? Are we going to move away from international travel to more domestic staycations? Is that going to be the future of the economy, of what stimulates economy and demand? 100%. Do we need more legislation? Do we need more initiatives to really attract and retain that talent and that demand? 100%. This model of you come, you work here, you send your money abroad. I think now more than ever, it's proving to be an unreliable model. And again, the impact of this, I think, is only going to be worse once the market goes back to some level of normal activity. Only then are you going to be able to quantify the labor lost and the talent that you lost. And it's really difficult to entice that back unless you put in measures that really stimulate demand. So issuing 5-10-year visas for residents based on ridiculous criteria, and I'll say it is ridiculous criteria, is definitely not the way forward and does need to change in order to stimulate demand going forward, because that demand needs to come from the local population. It's no longer about global. And this is the reason why I think places like Egypt and somewhere like Saudi will fare better than the UAE, than particularly Dubai, because they have that strong domestic advantage given the size of the population. Saudi, I don't know if you want to add anything.
No, I totally agree with you. We have another question from Suhail Hajjar. Maybe you can take this one, Dana.
Sure.
Suhail is interested by the flexible office space and the likes of WeWork, IWG. He would like us to elaborate a little bit more on the short and medium-term view on their evolution at the light of COVID-19. And I believe what applies to Dubai applies to the rest of the world. Go ahead, Dana.
Yeah. No, definitely. I mean, I think if anything, what we witnessed now, we were definitely, in terms of occupiers, in terms of corporates, this was definitely the route we were going down, more remote working, flexible spaces, co-working spaces. What's happened now is we were thrown in the deep end where nobody was ready for this. Obviously, corporates were taking their time, transitioning into more flexible spaces, into more flexible hours, taking up spaces in co-working locations. I mean, even here, in Abu Dhabi, WeWork opened and they had a really successful launch and membership subscription as well, which obviously went on hold. So nobody really saw that a virus would be the threat and that we will have to reassess models, but definitely a way going forward. I think, especially now with things like only 30% of the workforce can go back, are corporates really going to commit to 3 to 5 year leases? I personally don't believe so. So again, this is one model that will need to change in this part of the world, because otherwise my view is that corporates will take up space in co-working facilities that give that flexibility. So it's all about being flexible.
Yeah, I would add to that, Suhail, to answer the question from another angle. I would say this COVID-19 crisis has been really a wake-up call to a lot of companies. And I believe the working from home model has probably worked beyond the most optimistic scenarios that these companies were thinking about before the crisis. I believe that there's going to be a new paradigm in terms of the office requirements of companies, and that implies having that buffer, which is the flexible working space, which will absorb any surplus or reduced demand and serve as a buffer. There are two forces working against each other. First of all, clearly, companies realize that they don't necessarily need all that office space. This suggests that they will be letting go of a space, but at the same time, the social distancing rules, assuming they are extended, it means that companies will not be able to put as many employees in that same office. So two forces working against each other, and I believe flexible office, WeWork and the likes will be the buffer and will probably emerge as the winner, medium to long term. I don't know if there are any other questions.
Yeah, please do raise your hand. No, you're very thorough, Dana.
Sorry, I did talk a lot.
Oh, hang on, here's one.
Yeah.
You're asked.
Yeah.
What about the IFC real estate? Any views on its future? Suhail asking about the DIFC real estate, and I think Firas wants to say something also.
Why can't I see anything?
And I asked about financing, generally, the financing market in the UAE. Hi guys, hi Fadi, hi Dan.
Hi.
I mean, typically in this kind of cycle, banks tend to have less appetite to finance, and this is kind of where a lot of developers and a lot of investors are looking for mostly finance. Are you seeing any retraction from the market? And if so, are there any alternative sources of financing emerging here?
So let me take that one, Firas. You're absolutely right. In this kind of uncertainty, you're absolutely right. Banks tend to limit their growth ambition in terms of increasing their exposure to real estate sector. What the consistent feedback from lenders is that they are very much focusing on their existing client base, and they are trying to be creative, and that include extending bridge loans to some of them to help them overcome the crisis. So no more new BD for real estate lenders, but certainly a focus on managing their existing portfolio and being seen as being close to their clients in the borrowers in these uncertain times. Now, is there other ways of financing? Good question. There are other ways of financing, and that assumes a little bit of stability. But basically, we are receiving a lot of inquiries of companies who are inquiring about thematics such as sale and leasebacks. So basically, office occupiers who own their own real estate, and in order to release equity from their balance sheet, they are knocking on our doors to advise them on how to go for sale and leaseback. So they will no longer be owners, but they will be tenants of their own real estate. And on the other hand, there are investors who, despite the crisis, still would like to gain exposure to long-term, stable cash flows. So as sale and leaseback are definitely in the works, and we are entertaining a number of discussions around this theme.
Okay, there's two open questions.
So I can see the one from Wissam on hospitality.
Yeah.
Yeah, on the Airbnb model will get much more affected than the classical hotel model. So again, similar to the concept of co-working in the office space. Yes, in the short term, of course, Airbnb is getting impacted mainly because of travel restrictions, and there's no footfall. So short-term leases are getting impacted. But again, longer term, if hotels have to impose this 30% restrictions, if there's going to be, I mean, ultimately in the end, hotels that are going to win are those that have basically applied the most stringent cleanliness. Like that's going to be people's marketing campaign from now on, which hotel is cleaner than the other and safer. But in the longer term, I mean, I don't know how people feel. I particularly, if I'm traveling somewhere, I would much rather be in an Airbnb given these conditions than be in a hotel where I have to interact with other people or have members of staff coming in and out. So again, I think in the longer term, Airbnb short-term leases is going to be, will pick up. Yes, completely in the short term, that's absolutely out of the question given current market conditions, and they'll probably suffer more than hotels that have multiple chains and that have some level of cash on the side. But longer term, like with co-working, I think as people reassess their travel and logistics, it will pick up for people who want to be in separately in their private kind of experience, as opposed to being in a hotel and sharing amenities with others.
We have two questions one from Suhail about the DIFC. He wants to know specifically about the future of DIFC real estate.
Yeah.
If you can answer that one in 2 minutes, because we have another one that's very interesting also. But go ahead, Dana. Okay. DIFC?
So yes, so on the DIFC, I mean, again, as I mentioned, the DIFC, that don't know, it's the equivalent of Canary Wharf to some extent, right? It is the financial center, and it is where corporates want to be, and it's strictly made up of grade A office space, which again, as I said, is usually single-owned, has favorable legislation if you're within the DIFC core. Amenities, and the infrastructure to support, whether it's the metro station or parking. So DIFC to this date is quite strongly, like the demand's quite strong for the DIFC. That's paralleled with limited supply. So in terms of the commercial market, the only building within the DIFC that's going to be delivered, that was due to deliver actually, and is now being delayed, is the ICD Brookfield Place, which is already pre-let to a certain extent. This is a mandate that our agency, our leasing team is working on. And that's already pre-let to a certain extent by large corporate occupiers. But in terms of any future supply coming, that's restricted both on the resi and on the commercial side, which makes us believe that it will continue. Yes, we will see decline in rental rates and in values, but it will still be above market average. And this is just basically on performance over the past couple of years as well. And I'm more than happy to share some slides and charts specific to the DIFC and how the performance of the commercial market and the resi market always outperformed the average over the years. So strong demand and a shortage in supply within the DIFC works to its favor. I know they announced a massive scheme for the DIFC, expansion of the DIFC over by, where the palace is on the back of that. But again, this is an announced project and we don't think any of these will come into the pipeline anytime soon.
Another question, Dana, from Maria.
From Maria. Hi, Maria. So with commercial real estate expected to be tough times, compressed purchasing powers, any niche real estate products will witness growth as a result of the new consumer behavior. So two things here. I mean, if we're talking about the consumer as in private individuals or investors, but if we're talking about private individuals, I think there's going to be a lot more focus on, I think as consumers, we're paying a lot more attention to our environment. So things, as I mentioned, like sustainable fashion, sustainable retail is a sector that's expected to grow. And again, it's a conversation that we have with our EMEA retail teams, and it's based on what they're seeing as well in terms of requirements from retailers. Basically, you know, how do we become more sustainable? How do we become more ethical? Because these are the things that are attracting consumers these days. Similarly, we are another trend that we're looking into, and this was an interesting fact, and I have it here in front of yesterday's presentation on sustainability. In terms of the consumer and what they're likely to purchase going forward. It was an interesting study. Sorry, one second, fidgeting through paperwork. Participation in outdoor activities, so outdoor sports activities such as backpacking, mountain climbing and trail running, all these activities saw a double-digit increase in 2008 on the back of the global financial crisis. So the view is that they are likely to kind of increase as well. So again, in terms of retail, in terms of where the consumers are likely to put their buck, sustainability is a big one, but also in active wear or lounge wear if people are going to work from home. So these are from a consumer perspective. In terms of hotel, I think, again, in terms of the tourism industry, I think less on the big high-end hotels that have, 800 keys, more on the boutique niche hotels that really cater to 30 or 40 guests, or even Airbnb, just like I said, so from a consumer perspective, from a consumer spending. In terms of investors, if we're looking at as investors, as consumers, defensive sectors for sure, as Fadi mentioned, industry and logistics, things like education, healthcare, and again-
And data centers, by the way.
And data centers is a big one, definitely. And what we term as living, which is senior living or student accommodation. Again, student accommodation is a big one because for people living in the region who are used to traveling to London or to the US to study, I mean, the first thing we saw is a lot of these nationals came back home. So if they're likely to continue studying here, but want to live the student accommodation experience, that's definitely something that developers are looking at and investors should be looking at more.
Perfect. We have one question from Nadine. Nadine, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
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 Yeah, hi. Thank you for this. Thank you, Fadi and Dana, for this very clear presentation. It's a more macro question that I would like to ask. With the price of oil where it is, for all this region, is it going to continue? I mean, the government has the means to inject liquidity, and the model of are the taxes going to stay low, obviously to attract foreigners? I mean, what do you think about this more macro and what's going to happen if the price of oil stay that low?
I think, sorry, I'll just quickly answer this, Fadi, and then you can add, feel free to add. I think we definitely likely to see fees. They call them fees here, they're not called tax. But I think we're likely to see some increases. I mean, it's been a conversation that was in the pipeline for very long. We saw the implementation of VAT a couple of years ago in the region. So I think it's one way definitely that the government might be looking at to increase its revenues to support their ambitious spending plans, again, particularly in Saudi. So less so maybe in Dubai, given it's less reliant on oil prices, but more so in Saudi.
No, I mean, nothing much to add apart from the fact that, as we all know, the governments, the GCC government have, most of them have issued some jumbo bond issues in the last 3 weeks, which obviously is there to cater for A, the drop in oil price, B, the COVID-19. Undeniably, in order to reduce these fiscal imbalances that will emerge from this juncture, we expect absolutely some form of direct or indirect tax to increase. VAT is there. It doesn't take a lot to increase it from 10 to 11, 12 or 13%. The system is there, it's working. So definitely we are unfortunately less and less in the tax haven when we live in the GCC. And that trend has not started now, it started probably 10 years ago. These economies need to become sustainable, and for an economy to become sustainable, their government needs to raise tax.
And then, sorry, just to add, Fadi, going back to the conversation we were having about stimulating demand and basically offering more than just a 5 to 10 year visa, definitely, I mean, this, if governments are going to start charging higher tax, again, particularly in the UAE and Dubai, where it's expat dominant, 80% is an expat population, we're going to have to start thinking about the long term for a lot of these expats, because the moment it becomes more expensive to live here, there's absolutely no reason for people to be here anymore. If you're paying the VAT, you're already paying a lot of hidden fees. So even, I'll give you an example, like even when they support the economy, so DIWA, which is the authority in charge of electricity and water, announced a 10% reduction on utility payments for residents. I mean, they announced a 10% reduction when oil was already down 70%, which A, didn't make sense. But also they put that 10% reduction on the actual amount. If you really drill down into the bill, they kept out the municipality fee that they take on the back of that. They kept out a lot of the fees they take. So essentially, you're still paying a lot of those hefty fees. So ultimately, if these start increasing, people are going to question, as Fadi said, whether this is really the tax haven that people want to be in, or does it make more sense for me to go to London or to go elsewhere and pay the tax, but at least I'm getting something in return.
Thank you very much.
Perfect, thank you. I don't think we have any more questions.
I surely hope no one works in media.
Oh, hang on, one more. One more from Christian. Can you see it?
Yeah, new construction coming to Dubai. Slowdown in construction in downtown. Oh yeah, I live right next to this horrendous building in downtown, and the construction is still in full force. What is your view on this? Yes. I mean, again, it's one where, yes, they haven't really shut down formally, but during the period of the lockdown, the construction did slow down. And I live right next to an Emaar building, and it's a complete nightmare in downtown. But also in terms of handover. So the other thing is, even if construction does finish, a lot of developers are delaying the handover of their projects. We have a massive supply database which looks at project under construction. We update these on a quarterly basis, and a lot of the times the project or the building might be complete, but it's not being handed over. They're not getting, whether it's by choice from the developer or from the government, who are not granting the permissions, whether it's health and safety or whatever it is. So yes, construction is still ongoing, and they went full force the day the lockdown was eased. I completely agree. But in terms of official handing over, those will be delayed.
Perfect. One more on the opportunities.
$1 million question. Where's the opportunity? What's the next trade, Dana?
What's the next trade? Warehousing and storage space, for example. Yes, I think warehousing and storage space for sure. Especially, I mean, I rent a space in Al-Quoz for storage, because obviously the apartments here don't fit your entire life. And I was born and raised here, so I have 35 years worth of of stuff to place in storage here. And we actually know the owner of that storage space, and he's never been busier, because obviously, unfortunately, a lot of people have been made redundant. They're choosing, or people have chosen to go and quarantine in their countries and come back. A lot of people have stocked up. So warehousing and storage space, sure. Data centers, as Fadi mentioned, is a big one, especially as we move towards 5G. And this was one thing that Expo was meant to kind of expedite, this move towards 5G network. A lot of that will need heavy data centers to support. But again, as governments and people realize the importance of data as well, they want to be able to localize that.
The last one I would add is anything that touches on the sustainability thematic, where I mean, this crisis, and you know, the trend was here, but this crisis definitely served as a wake-up call for a lot of market players to focus on anything that promotes sustainability within the real estate industry. And therefore, again, the winners and the losers, there will be a new generation of real estate that will embed sustainability from the very first moment in the concept and designs, and of course later on in how do you operate in a sustainable manner, in a clean and healthy manner, your real estate. So that is also a theme that we believe will certainly come up with a lot of investment opportunities for you know, in the 2.0 era. I know it's high level. You know, real estate, unlike stock markets, are rather illiquid. So, you know, it's not a click of a button where, okay, oh, data center, okay, I'm going to buy a data center. It takes a lot to build a fund, to execute transactions, and to pick up there. And it's a very much a niche market that requires a specific expertise that this is why you have to rely on the fund manager, who will have a track record and credibility in delivering returns from this kind of niche opportunistic market.
Fadi, actually a question on data centers. You might be a bit familiar. Do you think it's one that's going to be, just like the logistics in the region, a bit more government dominated to begin with? Or do you see room for private players?
Definitely, it is moving to private players. I mean, for the moment in the GCC, data centers have been mostly set up by major developers in major developments, but little by little, the private sectors, I would say, and investors are getting more and more interested in that, and therefore we are seeing some emergence of transaction activity around data centers. So data centers changing hands and landing in fund structures, because on the other side there are investors who are very keen to gain exposure to data centers but cannot do it on their own. So we are seeing this shift, and this trend is here to stay. Smart warehousing. I think that's it, Jihan.
Thank you very much. Yes, I think we can wrap it up.
Excellent. So
apologies.
No, you go ahead, Jihan.
No, I was just saying apologies for everybody who had problems. Half of you were able to, half of you were not able to log in for some reason. But anyway, I'll let you wrap up, Fadi. Thank you both on behalf of you guys for giving us your time.
And as I said, we are from JLL. We have the ability to answer any question on any sector in any geography. So please feel free to shout if there is a specific subject that you want to drill a little bit deeper into. We totally realize that this is a high level. It can only be high level when we talk about global real estate and UAE real estate, but we definitely have a lot of data to share with whoever is interested. Thank you, everyone, and see you physically sometime soon.
Stay safe. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.